Standing at the heart of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., just a few minutes away from the White House, are a series of 5 bronze sculptures that remember one of the most significant presidents of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The third sculpture in the series features 5 men lined up alongside a brick wall. The scene is of a bread line, one of the many that formed across the country during the early 1930s, during the Great Depression, one of the most devastating periods of economic hardship that the world has ever experienced. Welcome to the road to the modern economy. Over the next 2 episodes, we're going to be taking a look at this period of time from 2 different perspectives. That of the English economist John Maynard Keynes, and then that of his American counterpart, Milton Friedman. On the 24th of October, 1929, New Yorkers woke up to a crisis. Across the city, brokers, investors, and everyday people with savings on the stock market tuned into radio broadcasts, transmitting news of a collapsing economy. Within minutes of the opening, the value of the New York Stock Exchange had begun to plummet. By the end of the day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen by 11% and showed no signs of recovering. The crash continued on the 25th, and the 26th, and the 27th, and on nearly every other trading day for the next 4 years. When the market's fall came to a halt in the early months of 1934, the index was down 84% from its peak just before the crash, and the global economy was in tatters. Within one of the richest nations on the planet, the United States, production had fallen by 45%. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs, throwing up to 90% children in some areas into poverty. And over 40% of the American banking sector had collapsed. Now, on the other side of the globe, in London, John Maynard Keynes, who was already a prominent economist and investor, known mainly for his critique of the Treaty of Versailles, would have been sleeping in peace when the crisis erupted. But that peace wouldn't last long. When Keynes got word of the crash, he was in a state of shock. Widely regarded as one of the greatest minds in the United Kingdom, if not the world, he'd built a career out of predicting the movements of the stock market, providing handsome returns to his investors in the process. As the global economy collapsed, so too did Keynes' own wealth. Over the course of the crash, he would lose nearly a quarter of his fortune. But this too would only be temporary. As the stock market bottomed out, Keynes stepped in, recovering most of his losses as the market recovered. Now, while the global economy was slowly falling into disarray, Keynes was holed up in Cambridge University, where he served as a professor, keenly observing the movements of prices, output, and employment numbers in an attempt to understand the nature of the crisis. Despite his lack of any formal training in economics, by 1930, Keynes had begun to coalesce his various insights into a comprehensive theory of the economy. Over the next 5 years, he would write the general theory of employment, interest, and money in multiple parts. Though Keynes conceived of the general theory against the backdrop of the Depression, he intentionally rarely referred to the crisis in his book. Instead, the general theory was meant to be just that, general. He sought to form a set of meaningful generalizations based on the economic conditions of the time. In any economy, the total demand for goods and services is based upon the level of consumption by people, investment by businesses, government spending, and exports. When the American banking sector collapsed in 1929, lending ceased across nearly every area of the economy, resulting in a sudden collapse in the level of investments conducted by businesses, and therefore the overall level of demand within the economy. With this in mind, Keynes defined recessions and depressions as being periods during which the demand for goods drops below the supply of goods across the entire economy, creating a period of excess production. Most economists in the 1930s agreed with this definition of a recession and depression, but they clung to a belief in the self-correcting nature of markets. When the demand for goods fell, they argued, prices across the economy would fall with it, adjusting to the new economic reality. In their view, any shock to the economy would be temporary and painless. But as employment figures continued to rise each month for years on end, the narratives held on the minds of politicians and bureaucrats became increasingly difficult to justify. In the general theory, Keynes didn't dispute that markets would eventually correct themselves, but he argued that the process was a painful and protracted one, costing millions of people their jobs, if not their lives. Keynes argued that societies would be irrevocably damaged by long periods of unemployment that many workers would face as prices adjusted. So what did the other economists get wrong? Keynes realized that when the demand for goods and services falls, businesses are reluctant to immediately shift their prices in any direction. They simply alter their level of production to meet demand. However, they will change their level of investments in their business, which would then impact their ability to produce goods in the future. In Keynes's view, economies only became self-correcting once the changes in investment start to affect the supply of goods. Under normal conditions, this process could take years. But during a crisis as severe as the Great Depression, decreases in production lead to extreme levels of unemployment, which in turn causes demand to drop even further, creating a feedback loop that prevents the economy from recovering. Only the government, he argued, could break the loop. By buying up goods and services, businesses begin to make investments and hire new workers. Unemployment would fall, and people could begin to consume again, with the excess produce quickly disappearing. Even before the general theory was released, Keynes had made multiple trips to the United States to encourage the country's leaders to begin a program of spending that could allow the American economy to recover. In 1935, just a year before his book's release, Keynes met Roosevelt in the White House and urged him to embark on a program of deficit spending. Though he didn't go as far as Keynes wanted, Roosevelt would soon launch the New Deal, an expansive set of infrastructure, agricultural, public employment, and social protection programs. In a few short years, the US government spent $41 billion, approximately 40% of the country's GDP, in 1929. Yet even this level of spending wasn't great enough to kickstart the American economy. That would only come a full decade after the initial crash, in 1939, when the United States joined World War II. When the Japanese government attacked Pearl Harbor, the American unemployment rate stood at around 25%, compared to 3.2% in 1929. As the United States joined the conflict, Roosevelt oversaw a reorientation of the American economy to support the war effort. In addition, 16 million people, or roughly 12% of the American workforce, were commissioned to serve in the military. With the war raging in the Pacific and European theaters, America's domestic economy began to rapidly recover. By the time the war ended in 1945, unemployment had fallen to just 1.9%. As troops returned, that number would rise to between 3 to 5%, where it would remain for nearly 3 decades. Following the Great Depression, governments across the world adopted Keynes's outlook on the economy, using the power of government spending to ensure the demand remained consistent and sustainably high. For decades, this approach held. However, in the mid-1970s, the global economy would experience a bout of inflation coupled with economic stagnation, aptly nicknamed stagflation, that would, at least temporarily, diminish the importance of Keynesian ideas in economic policy making. Now, many of Keynes's ideas about the economy were rooted in his analysis of the Phillips curve, a graphical description of the relationship between inflation and unemployment. According to the Phillips curve, as unemployment approaches zero, inflation would rise exponentially. Full employment was impossible. However, the Phillips curve also implied that a period of economic stagnation should result in prices remaining stationary. Since employment isn't falling, inflation shouldn't be rising. When the stagflation crisis hit, during Jimmy Carter's presidency, economists and politicians alike began to lose faith in Keynes's ideas. Instead, an alternative school of economic thought rose to prominence, monetarism, which claimed that the country's money supply was the primary driver of economic activity. And so, for decades, Keynes's ideas were largely sidelined by policymakers. In New Zealand, Don Brash's tenure as the managing director of the Reserve Bank during the latter half of the 1980s was marked by a drastic construction of the country's money supply. Within academia, though, Keynes's ideas would be repeatedly revised and reformed by hundreds of academics who added caveats, provisos, and exceptions to his original theory. Some tended to move his ideas closer to classical economics, but others, such as the post-Keynesian ideas of his student Joan Robinson, which we'll be covering in a later episode, bore little resemblance to the ideas that existed prior to him. For decades, there was little change. Neoclassical ideas prevailed within the halls of power, while Keynesians in academia spent decades fixing perceived issues. However, in 2008, when countries across the world experienced the most severe recession since the Great Depression, governments mobilized to pass expensive stimulus packages, worth trillions of dollars, in order to prevent the global economy from sliding into a second Great Depression. For the most part, it worked. Though many suffered immensely, most economies managed to recover from the crisis of 2008 within a few years. With that, Keynes's ideas began to re-enter the economic mainstream, where they now form the basis of one of the two major schools of orthodox economics. Across most parts of the world, Keynes' ideas have once again begun to shape policy, decisions, and discussions. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Road to the Modern Economy. Please join us next time as we look at the other major school of economics that emerged from the crisis of the 1930s, monetarism.